there clearly were. Welcome to Behind the Pages. Rebecca Makkai is with us today to talk about The 100-Year House. In addition to having written this novel, Rebecca is the very successful author of The Borrower. She has also written other stories that have appeared on NPR. And she's here today to talk about The 100-Year House, which is her second novel. This novel is set in a house that is 100 years old and is set in 3 different time periods, starting with the current time and then moving back in time. And really it is a look in how the setting of someone's life can change or affect the paths that a person takes. Welcome.
Thank you.
So let's start by having you give us a little bit more detail about your book.
Absolutely. I'm finding it increasingly difficult to describe, actually. When I was writing it, I would tell people it's the story of a haunted house and a haunted family told in reverse. But it's not really about ghosts. That's not really the main component. So I've tried to recalibrate, and the more I hear other people describe it, the more confused I get. But
so I hope I didn't increase that
No,
confusion.
not at all. Not at all. It's the story of this one estate and the people living in it, told backwards over the 20th century. So we start in 1999, we go back to 1900. And what's unique about this house, besides its size and opulence, is the fact that in the 20s and 30s, it was an artist's colony. So when we start in 1999, there's a character who's very interested in researching the history of the house, particularly one poet, Edwin Parfitt, who stayed there when it was a colony. He gets a certain way in his research to a certain point, but not all the way. So it's the reader who, by going back in subsequent sections to the 50s and then the 20s, actually gets to meet Edwin Parfitt, actually gets to find out about some kind of scandalous things, some very tragic things that happened in the house. But there's a great sense of fun, at least that I felt when I was writing it, and that I think is coming through to readers too. So it's like I can make it sound dark, and it's not a dark book.
No, it isn't. It isn't. The first part of the book does, as you said, focus on contemporary time, and the main character of the first part is Z, I would say, who grew up in the house and has now returned as an adult with her husband. They're living in the carriage house. And she's sort of moving on in her career, and he's kind of stuck in idle.
Yes.
In more ways than one. So she tells us, she sort of is thinking of somewhat of her childhood, and she tells us that when she was growing up, at one point her mother asked her about whether she was depressed, and said, because your great-grandmother killed herself in this house. And right after that, Z starts hearing and seeing evidence of a ghost living in the house, assumes it's this woman. Why is that?
This was really fun for me. I think one of the components of any ghost story, any effective ghost story, needs to be that there's some character in there who's skeptical. And that's a stand-in for the reader. That person who is going, oh yeah, everyone says this house is haunted, but I'm a rationalist. And then when that person starts to see things, it's what draws the reader in too. That's our person in that book.
Yeah.
And in this story, that stand-in for the reader is Z, this person who prides herself on being extremely rational. She's a Marxist literary scholar. She's analyzes everything. And in her childhood, sort of believed there was a ghost, but feels like, here I am, I'm an adult, I'm past that. And not coincidentally gets roped into teaching a course at the college on the tradition of ghost stories in British and American literature. And there's some combination of teaching that course and her marriage falling apart, a lot of stress that she's under, that leads her eventually to believe, maybe not that there's a ghost that's about to pop out from behind the wall, but to feel that there's something deeply wrong with the house, with its energy, that that's why things have been going wrong in her life. And in fact, she's not the only one. If anything, the legacy of this house, the way it affects the characters, is through extraordinary luck, whether good or bad. And Z's one of those characters who seems to have extraordinarily bad luck in the house. Other people come and are sort of blessed and everything goes their way. But she feels that things aren't just 50-50 up to chance. She feels that something's funny here.
Yeah, she does. And I wondered too, as an adolescent, when she heard about her great grandmother, if she felt some kind of connection to this woman, that she wanted to be able to see her ghost. Were they both feeling misunderstood, not like somebody was affecting the path that they were trying to take,
Right.
And I wondered if she kind of almost conjured her a bit.
Oh, absolutely. And one of the things about Violet DeVore, this woman who was supposed to have killed herself in, I think, 1906,
Right.
Is that no one knows much about her at all. They know that she killed herself, but no one actually knows how.
Right.
And even in the 1999 section, when people start researching it, they're not able to find anything out.
Right.
There's some clue about starvation that doesn't make any sense to them because this is a wealthy family.
Yeah.
And so since she's a blank slate, all they really have to go by is this giant oil portrait of her that still hangs in the dining room. That's spooky in the way that a lot of old portraits are.
Yeah.
It's really a sort of a Rorschach test
Yeah.
for these people. They see in that ghost what they want to see, and people have different theories in the different time periods as to how she died and what happened, and only some of them, as we go very far back, actually know the true story. And yes, I think that Z, as a child, we find out, was someone who grew up very lonely, an only child of two parents who were each quite strange in their own way and weren't actually in love with each other, and they were quite detached from the community.
Yes.
So like many people who live in this house over the course of the century,
Yeah.
very detached and isolated and sort of at the mercy of the house, and more importantly, at the mercy of their own imagination.
Right, exactly. Yeah, that's what I would say too. She learned about her great-grandmother when she was on home on break from boarding school where she
Yes.
had gone. Her mother, asks her, tells her that, oh, you look a little down, and as I said, tells her about her great-grandmother. If we could ask Z at that point, how concerned would she tell us her mother was?
About her or about
Yes.
the ghost?
No, about
her.
Yeah.
I think even as an adolescent, she knew she wasn't really.
Yeah.
This mother is someone who's very self-absorbed, and has, as we find out, I don't think this would give much away to say, as we find out, she's undertaken a massive self-reinvention over the course of her own life. But I
Yeah.
think that requires her to focus so much on the self and on the presentation of the self that she doesn't have that full capacity to see someone else. And that's part of Z's loneliness. She has a mother who's not fully engaged and who isn't really who she says she is in some ways.
Yeah. And also a father who I think was much more involved with her, but she lost him.
Lost him very young,
Yeah.
yes, and who also was living a lot of lies, we find out later.
She doesn't ever find that
No,
out. Right,
she has
but
no
we know
idea.
that.
Yeah.
So you started to mention that she is teaching a course on ghosts in literature, which she has agreed to do with some reluctance.
Yes.
She said that if she had taken this course when she was in college, it would have really killed the mystique of her grandmother. As the story opens, has life done that for her anyway?
It has, but then that unravels. I think she feels that her rational mind is a point of arrival. It's something that will never leave her. This is the way she sees the world, and she's able to analyze her way, strategize her way, she believes, out of almost anything, including marital difficulty. She tries to play chess, basically, with her marriage. And none of that works for her. It fails spectacularly. There was something very fun as a writer about writing someone so wound up and who needed to have such control that it can't last very long. And there's something fun about, I always feel like a minor Olympian god doing mischievous things with my characters when I'm writing, but coming down and just pulling that string that's going to unravel her. And that's what you do with so many characters, but it's more fun when they're really tightly wound like that, when they really feel like they're in control.
Yeah, although I would say that no matter what, she stays in control of her life. It just takes a different direction than she was planning on.
She does, and she leaves the book in a sort of spectacular fashion. You know,
but she comes out on top. I mean, she is not defeated. She's just decided this particular thing isn't going to work. But I mean, as a person and in her life, she moves on.
Yes, yes. And what she feels eventually, that getting away from the house is the thing she needs to do. And perhaps that's true.
Yeah.
You know, as an author, I had to remain quite undecided on exactly what's the imagination and what's the house, because my characters were undecided. So I'm still, I still don't know. But she felt that she had to get away from that house.
You want to tell us what her husband Doug is doing in secret?
Yes.
Because that's kind of fun, and it doesn't.
I will betray him and tell his secrets. So Doug has a PhD, like Z, in English literature, and is meant to be turning his doctoral dissertation on the poet Edwin Parfitt into a monograph, so a book that he can publish and get a tenure-track job. And he's having trouble getting employment, as you know, it's worse now, but even in 1999, this was an issue for PhDs. And what he's gotten roped into instead, just to earn some money for himself, not to be reliant on his wife's family, is someone has hooked him up with a job ghostwriting books for preteen girls, this series of books called the Friends for Life series. So you could think of it as sort of the Babysitter's Club or Sweet Valley High. It was fun to do some research into the way those series are ghostwritten.
That was fascinating, yes.
Yeah, he gets this huge, they call it the Bible, this huge binder in the mail that includes all the information. I'm sure nowadays it's a computer file. But fortunately, my source on this had written these in the 90s, so I got that scoop. But he's working in secret whenever Z isn't home, and you know, really feels like he's sold himself, his masculinity, his intelligence, you know, just to get this money. Fortunately for him, some of the crumbs on the trail, actually, of Edwin Parfitt start picking up. What really sets his story in motion is the fact, as he's known all along, that back when this house, Laurelfield, was an artist's colony, Edwin Parfitt stayed there. He doesn't think anything's going to come of that. Many artists and writers stayed there. But he discovers pretty early on that there might still be some files around there, some kinds of records of the colony, and that's the kind of thing, that sort of original research that could get his project back on track. And it, more than anything, gets his life back on track. He has some purpose and some self-respect when he's digging into that.
A little more than these teenage novels. I mean, he does them in real secret, and you know, whenever Z is around at the computer, I think it's a separate file on his computer that she's not meant to see. What is his main reason he doesn't want her to see it? Is it because it will alter her view of him, or because he'll have to confront that his own view of himself is not?
I'm sure it's both. You know, the way that those things so often are. He presumes what her judgment would be. He can imagine the look on her face, what she'd say to him. And you know, she has such high hopes for him. She believes that he's really writing this book that he's supposed to be writing, and she's trying to pull strings to get him a job. And you know, disappointing her would be huge to him, but that the reason it would be that he's disappointing himself, of course. What ends up being strange and being one of the things that starts to unravel their marriage is that because he's kept that one secret from her, he starts to keep more. So when he does get on that trail of these colony files that maybe he can find, he doesn't tell her that either. He worries she's going to jump in and ruin it for him. He wants to do it on his own. There's another couple that's moved into this coach house with them.
I should say that too.
And he brings the other woman, who's just a friend, but you know, brings her in on the secret with him. And of course Z thinks their secret is something else. Catches on that there's something. So the secrets beget secrets, which beget secrets, and it's that little wedge that begins to drive them apart.
Well, his obsession with these files, is that another delaying tactic, or is this really going to say that the files were there? what would that really do for what he's supposed to be doing?
You know, that's the thing. Presumably it wouldn't do much.
Yeah.
And, you know, he's imagining, and even as he is trying to get into the attic where he knows these files are, he keeps telling himself, if anything's there, it's probably heating bills. It's probably, you know, deposit slips or things. What he does find, though, so in a way, it really is more of a delay tactic, and he knows that, but it's something. It gets him on track, sort of. It re-inspires him. When he does get to those files, what he finds is very disturbing and strange, and something that he won't ever have the answers to. By the end of the book, although we've gone back in time and are never going to get back to the 1999 section, we learn that he might have actually found something there at the end that really would change the course of his academic career. Without, I shouldn't give away any more than that, but you know, eventually one assumes he probably does write a pretty successful book about Edwin Parfit, this poet.
Exactly. Z's mother, Gracie, announces that she has invited her husband's son and daughter-in-law to come live with him. This is what you were starting to talk about, and that they will be living in the carriage house with Z and Doug, not in the main house, which is supposed to be a very big house. You know, I thought that was it was funny of Gracie. Just nobody ever says to Gracie, you know, well, how come with this huge house you're living in, a bedroom can't be found there too? You know, but they don't. Z is, of course, very unhappy about this, but she doesn't argue it out with her mother. Why is this?
I think she knows it's not worth it. You know, they're both extremely strong-willed people. And they've come to a lot of understandings of things they won't talk about. One of them is money. The fact that Gracie is very wealthy living in this house, and Z is a Marxist literary scholar, is sort of accepting the money in terms of staying in the house, but probably won't ever take the actual money when her mother passes away. So they play a little bit of an avoidance game, as I think we do in so many families. You just discover the things you can't and shouldn't talk about, and then you don't talk about them ever again. So
exactly. Plus, Z is living there under, you know, her mother's good graces too. So it's a little bit of a power, you know, a little bit of a, you know, power exchange at this point, or change in the dynamics of their relationship. Because when Z wasn't living at home, she might have been more free to speak her mind. Obviously, not this particular issue, but now that she's living there, you can kind of see her slipping a little bit more into her adolescent self, where you really couldn't speak up to this remote woman.
Yes, and I think that sort of thing that happens to everyone when they go home to family, and you go back to your childhood role, whether it's with a sibling or with your parent. Absolutely, and she knows she can't, she has no grounds to stand on to say, well, I'm accepting your charity, but these other people shouldn't be allowed to, and you shouldn't extend it to them. And you know, she's embarrassed to have accepted the place to stay to begin with. So,
Well, if we could ask Gracie at that moment how that conversation went when she announced that the other two were moving in, what would Gracie tell us?
Oh, I think she would think it was great. It went perfectly. And I think she thinks she's doing them a favor in so many ways. She, you know, thinks this, you know, she knows that Doug needs to get out of the house and get a job. She thinks that this is going to inspire him too, or that he can, she has this mistaken notion throughout that he himself is a poet, although he's actually just writing about a poet. And I think she says at one point that he can even write about them. And you know, the kind of blithe thing that someone like her would think, that everything of course is great. And of course she is doing them a huge favor. She's right. You know?
She is. Well, when Doug first meets Miriam, the daughter-in-law, he's both sort of detached and drawn to her at the same time. He describes it as if he's in a movie watching himself, and he's meant to fall in love with her. Has he been writing too many teen novels?
Oh, certainly, certainly, He's thinking in this sort of fictional mindset, and he's alone in his house all day with his own thoughts. He's a bit of a worrier to begin with. And moreover, I think he understands that there's something about this situation that these two couples are living in this house. His wife is off teaching. Miriam's husband is off trying to find a new job. He's gone all day. They are about the same age, and they're left alone in this house all day long together. And I think he's just hyper aware of what that situation implies, what it is, what people would think about that.
Right.
And I think he's in denial for a very long time of the fact that he is attracted to her, which is probably why that scenario springs to mind. If he hadn't been attracted in the slightest, it might not have occurred to him. But he's worried that that's the expectation. Everyone's going to think I'm supposed to fall in love with her. Of course, that is what everyone thinks. Z thinks it, Doug's friend thinks it. And things happen, you know, that, that I shouldn't give away. But, but there's a reason he's paranoid, because there's a little speck of truth to that.
Yet it's funny because he, you know, as we've mentioned, is pretty, you know, stuck in one place. He's not working on his novel. He's sort of going off in these paths that are not really helping. But he's attracted to two very driven women, isn't he?
He is, and driven in very different ways.
Yeah, I mean, Miriam works on her art all the time.
Yes. Yeah, what she makes is collages out of, sort of mosaic-style collages out of found objects, detritus, broken pottery, things like that. And he's put off by her art at first, and Z is very dismissive of her art. But as we go along, we learn that she's actually quite successful. She's very driven. And her art, you know, I found myself enjoying the descriptions of her art. I felt like, yeah, this is cool. I want someone to actually make this thing now that I described. I like it. She, when he does pull her rather than his wife into this secret that there might be these files that he could access, she really eggs him on. She's the one who sort of finds it really fun. She has very little at stake, so she's going, yeah, let's do this. And I think if he hadn't told her, if he hadn't brought her into that, he might have wallowed around some more. What's interesting, they're both very driven, but Z being so driven didn't really do much to get him going.
No,
it intimidated him. Miriam's drive is more suited to who he is. And maybe that's one of the reasons he's pulled towards her rather than towards his wife, because of how she makes him see himself. I think that's so often why we're drawn to someone. It's how we feel that we are perceived, how we feel like we are.
And also Z and Doug have the same career. She can be successful in a different field, and so it probably doesn't feel quite so much of a slap in the face.
Right. I think he does feel a little emasculated.
Z tells her friend Chantel that the worst part of having Miriam, and Miriam's husband is named Case, living in the house is that Doug is going to fall in love with Miriam because he's so desperate to avoid working on what he's supposed to be doing. Has she seen anything as they first move in that makes her say this?
I don't think so. I think she knows, you know, that there's this possibility. She knows her husband very well. And she knows that he's looking for distractions. She knows they're in the house all day. She can see that Miriam is relatively attractive. She can see that Miriam might fall for Doug. Doug has a way with women, and you know, despite his, Z sometimes refers to him as Doe. You know, because his last name starts with an H and spells dough even, and she makes fun of this, but she knows he somehow, despite all that, has a way with women. Miriam's husband is terrible, that there might be some attraction. So she's right. What she's wrong about, though, is why. You know, she feels that this will be a distraction for Doug. In fact, Miriam is the very thing that gets Doug's career back on track, that gets him pursuing his original passion for this, researching this poet.
Exactly, Zia and Doug actually have something in common regarding the people who had the most who had a large, I should say, influence on their life. And that is that they both are focused on someone who committed suicide. How did you decide to have suicide be, you know, I mean, it's be like sort of a driving force in both of their lives?
You know, I didn't set out to write a book about suicide, certainly.
No, yeah.
And as the book goes on, without giving much away, when you get back to the 20s, the idea of suicide is sort of turned on its head. That there are other ways of doing away with your life.
Yeah,
There are ways
yeah.
of starting over. And in fact, what we learn about both Edwin Parfit, the poet, and Violet, is that suicide meant very different things to the two of them. And but yes, the poet Edwin Parfit, who Doug is drawn to research, killed himself after his lover died in the Second World War. Violet is the great-grandmother who somehow killed herself in the house. And there's the connection isn't lost on these characters. Doug thinks a lot about Parfit's suicide, about the fact that he spent time in this house that was haunted by a suicide, and did that affect him?
Right.
And in fact, when we do meet Edwin Parfit back in the 20s, he's very much affected by the house.
Yes.
He's very much thinking about Violet DeVore and her suicide and what that meant. And it definitely alters the course of his life to have stayed there, to have thought about her in that way. I think, you know, in many ways, thematically, it's a book about radical self-reinvention and the different forms that can take. Whether it's basically identity theft, which goes on, not to give much away, but goes on a bit in the novel, or even the ways that suicide could be seen as a radical self-reinvention.
Right.
And down to the way that Doug, you know, turns his life around and becomes someone new, the way that Z starts a new life somewhere. So the suicide fits with all of that. It's the path that some people have chosen, and fortunately, I think the reason ultimately it's a relatively uplifting book is that we're left in the end with people who contemplated that course but actually chose another one and found other ways to end one life but start another as well.
In the minute or two that we have left, I would like to ask you a little bit about the writing of this book. How did you come up with the idea of writing this particular story?
It started as a short story about male anorexia.
Oh, that didn't appear, did it?
Yeah, you weren't guessing that, were you? If you want to know who was anorexic, it was Steve, who is not in the book at all.
Okay.
So you're not missing anything.
Okay.
Steve turned into Case, Miriam's husband, in the 1999
Yes.
section. But it started as a short story about these two couples who moved in together in this coach house. And the main thrust of the story, though, was that the character who became Doug was the only one who noticed that the other man was anorexic, and no one would believe him. And he went around following him, trying to count his calories and writing everything down in his little notebook. It didn't work as a short story for several reasons. It was too long, and it just didn't work. But I came back to it years later, and I liked that original conflict of the two couples forced together in the house. You know, that's how, you know, close quarters are how a lot of conflicts start, and it seemed like a good engine for fiction. And I liked the idea of secrets, of people trying to discover each other's secrets in such close quarters. So it turned into something very, very different, but that was the origin.
And that's the joy of writing.
Exactly.
Well, unfortunately, we are out of time, but I want to thank you for being with us today.
Thank you so much.
And you have been watching Behind the Pages from the staff of 22 City View. I'm Diane Goshgarian, and I will explain more in a moment.
I understand.
Yes,
Sounds good.
You've been through this before.
Sounds good.